Pacifism is a naive idea perpetuated by people with either a surface-level understanding of geopolitics and history, or by people who would benefit from a weaker adversary and a population who lacks the will to fight. The idea of pacifism is in some ways or others ethical opposition to war and violence. The word pacifism itself can be traced as far back as to the times of the Romans, in Latin being Paxificus. Pax in Latin means peace, whereas ficus means to create. The word didn't come into use in English for the first time until 1901, when Émile Altaud first used the French word pacifisme in a book written in English. The idea of pacifism has almost always existed in most of the world for a very long amount of time, likely since organized conflict and language became commonplace. One of the most common arguments that takes place around pacifism is the idea of can a war be justified? Most self-proclaimed pacifists would argue that no war can be justified and that armed conflict is terrible and only brings about death. This idea is especially prevalent in the American mindset due to the brutal televised horrors of the Vietnam War. Many wars are not just. They are not right from a moral, ethical, and or strategic position. There are many examples of such wars. For instance, America and Vietnam, America's countless wars against the Native Americans, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the Second Gulf War. There are, however, many just wars. For instance, World War II, the 1990-1991 invasion of Iraq, also known as Operation Desert Storm, and also known as the First Gulf War. So why is the First Gulf War a justified war, but the Second Gulf War, just 12 years later, with the exact same sides, not a justified war? In the years leading up to the First Gulf War, Iraq had built a massive military and threatened and attacked multiple nations around them. They seized a very large portion of the oil supply, attacked a sovereign state of Kuwait, and threatened Saudi Arabia, which, should they have also taken them over, would have given them a majority of the world's oil supply. While most might initially play this off as countries fighting over oil again, this is rather extremely concerning. Most everything in the modern industrialized world now uses some kind of energy to operate, like electricity or gasoline. This means that there is a very high demand for oil. Should one country get control of a large portion of the world's oil supply, they would be able to gain massive geopolitical sway and importance and dictate the price of oil, which they can then use to break other countries apart, such as Venezuela, a petrostate which has faced massive internal political and economic upheaval due to sudden drops in the price of oil multiple times. Iraq, ruled by the dictator Saddam Hussein, was most definitely attempting to control the world's oil market. Along with threatening multiple sovereign nations, the political oppression and violence by the state on ethnic minority groups was more than enough reason to invade and depose Saddam. This didn't happen. While Kuwait was liberated, the Iraqi army was all but annihilated. A treaty was signed after a month of warfare. Saddam remained in power. A decade then passed, and on September 11, 2001, Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 planes to crash them into major economic and government buildings, of which one failed to reach its target. Following a mass wave of sorrow and massive anti-Muslim sentiment, the Bush government began drawing up plans for a second invasion of Iraq. The reasoning? Saddam has massive stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, had used them on their own ethnic minorities, and had been connected to Al-Qaeda, the group responsible for the 9/11 attack. The U.S. government also claimed it wanted to bring democracy to the Middle East, as well as control the Iraqi oil. So what was the problem? To start, a formal UN investigation into WMDs in Iraq concluded that there were no nuclear weapons. They had, however, retained the ability to make nuclear weapons after the sanctions ended, which is technically not in violation of the treaty. The US government also used the fact that Iraq had chemical weapons to claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which, while correct, was a deliberate attempt to mislead the public into thinking that Iraq had nuclear weapons. Also, Iraq had stopped the production of chemical weapons. However, there were still stockpiles of them which hadn't been found by the UN group tasked with destroying them, and many weapons were very similar to other kinds of weapons, which led to confusion, and neither the UN or Iraqis knew which was actually a chemical weapon until one of them exploded by accident, due to being degraded after years of neglect. Also, many of the other claims made by the American and British governments were very dubious in origin and poorly explained to the UN. Following the end of the invasion, American soldiers unnecessarily occupied the country and had troops stationed in Iraq until Obama in which they were almost pulled completely out of Iraq until they redeployed to take part in the 2015 Syrian civil war and fight against ISIS. American troops have never left Iraq since the invasion, but the true nature of their deployment has changed from occupation. Pacifism is an ignorant idea promoted by those with a skin-deep layer of knowledge in geopolitics. While pacifism would have kept us out from the mess that was Vietnam and Iraq in 2003, it wouldn't have helped the Middle East under the Iraqis, or have saved Europe from the horrors of the Nazis. The real solution is better judgment interventionism, than to avoid conflict even when necessary for the safety and security of U.S. allies and interests.